Okay, so this is a short revision video about one of the poems from the Power and Conflict AQA anthology. We're going to have a look at Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, and I'm going to be taking you through these stages. So we'll look at the context of the poet and the poem, the title, brief overview of the meaning. I'll read the poem, and then we'll look at the line-by-line analysis, try and draw together some of the key themes, have a little bit of a chat about structure, and then think about potential comparisons to other poems within the AQA anthology. So to start off, who's this poem by? Well, it's by this man, Ted Hughes. So Ted Hughes, he died in the late 20th century, born in 1930. So although this is a war poem, he didn't fight in a war. He was actually best known for his nature poems. However, a little bit of interesting context about him is that his father did fight in World War I, and Ted Hughes was a fan of Wilfred Owen's poems, and he actually felt that Wilfred Owen's poetry sort of represented his father's experiences. So if you're looking at other poems in the anthology, Exposure might be the sort of poem that Ted Hughes would say represented his father's experiences of this poem, Bayonet Charge, which is another poem about war and conflict. So the title. So a bayonet charge. If this is a rifle, a bayonet is this bit at the end. So you can see it's sort of like a knife and an attachment you would affix to the end of your rifle, and then you would perhaps go over the top from a trench and charge at the enemy. And although we don't know precisely what war this poem is about, it seems to represent the universal experience of a soldier. Given the mention of a king in the poem and the use of this bayonet, we could perhaps infer that it was a World War I poem, so the idea of trench warfare and having to charge around against the enemy over the top would be quite common. And what is the meaning of the poem? Well, roughly, it is the experience of a soldier. Universal experience, one of fear, one of conflict, one of terror, discomfort, and perhaps the feeling that as an individual you seem pretty powerless and you're not sure why you're out there fighting. So let's read the poem. Bayonet Charge. Suddenly he awoke and was running raw. In raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. Hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle numbs a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue, crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. Okay, so we're going to go through the poem line by line and just have a look at some of the language and some of the mood and the feelings that evokes, and perhaps some of the main images too. So the first word of the poem is actually quite significant, not only from a language perspective, but from a structural point. We have this quite dramatic adverb, suddenly, and straight away we are plunged into the action. It is disorientating and confusing, which could echo the experience of a soldier. And this soldier, suddenly he awoke and was running. So it's like he's literally just woken up, which might make us think that the experience of a soldier could be nightmarish. It's as if he's woke up and it's dramatic and we're thrust into this nightmare that the soldier is having. And he was running raw, in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy. Now, if you're unsure what khaki is, khaki refers to the colour that typically you would see in a soldier's uniform, so this muddy, greeny, browny colour. So he is running raw in raw-seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy. So we immediately get this idea that he is very uncomfortable. He is in a lot of pain. It is not a pleasant situation. He is raw in raw-seamed hot khaki. Now this word raw is obviously repeated, and that could be significant. What does raw mean? Well, raw has several meanings, I suppose. Rawness is like the pain associated with when your skin is uncomfortable and perhaps it's been cut or scrazed. We also have this idea of a raw recruit, someone who is innocent, someone who is young, someone who perhaps isn't ready for the horrors of war, and perhaps even the idea of raw meat, as if these soldiers were a little bit like cows being sent for the slaughter, which is reminiscent of Wilfred Owen poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth, which you might want to look up. Okay, so he's in raw-seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. So he's stumbling, which means he lacks control. It means that he is struggling to move under the heavy, uncomfortable sweat and this uncomfortable uniform. And this green hedge dazzles with rifle fire. So this green hedge is a bit like the enemy. You have to imagine, we can't really see the enemy here, but we just know that these rifle shots are coming from the green hedge. Hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. More images of pain, more images of violence. Bullets smacking the belly. This consonants, these plosive sounds, b, sm, k, b, they're violent and they underline the violence of all these bullets flying around. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. So he is carrying this rifle with difficulty. He is lugging it. It is uncomfortable and it is numb as a smashed arm. This verb, it's an adjective in this sense describing the arm. It's like his arm has been destroyed. He's feeling this pain, and if the rifle is numb as a smashed arm, this use of a simile almost suggests that the numb rifle has become part of him, this image of pain and this rifle. Then we have quite an interesting line, the patriotic tear that brimmed in his eyes, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. Now this to me suggests that he may have felt patriotism one time. He may have, perhaps as a young recruit, been sold this idea of war being glorious and fighting for your country being a wonderful thing to do, and he felt patriotism. But now this tear is sweating like molten iron. Yet another simile. And if you imagine molten iron, it is hot, it is painful, and if your tears have become or are sweating like iron, it suggests yet another feeling of pain here and heat. He's hot, he's sweating, he's uncomfortable, his tears, which may have been patriotic once, have become painful. So this patriotism seems to have departed. Okay, now we come to perhaps the most interesting stanza of the poem. We have 1, 2, 3 stanzas. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. So if he's feeling bewilderment, he is perhaps unaware of his surroundings, perhaps uncertain and almost flabbergasted, shocked at what is happening. And in this moment of almost stopping, he asks a very significant question. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing at that second? Well, let's have a look at a clock. Here is some clockwork. You have some mechanisms, you have a machine, and if the clockwork is cold, coldness could be associated with perhaps not feeling very much, a lack of emotion. So we're getting the idea that perhaps he feels like the clockwork, this machine, which belongs to the stars and the nations, is cold and unfeeling. And who are the stars and who are the nations? Well, the nation could be Britain, it could be any other country which chooses to send its men to war, or perhaps women to war. And we get the impression that if he is the hand of this clock, he is powerless. He is part of this wider machine, this machine which sends young men to war, and he's questioning sort of his position. Why is he there? Which is quite an intelligent and rational thing to question. He imagines he is the hand of a clock, and much like a clock, we could argue that wars tick onwards and they continue, and it sort of seems like the actions of one ordinary person are fairly inconsequential when you compare the power of the nations or the stars. And the stars, of course, as you will know from your study of Romeo and Juliet, well, could link to destiny or fate, or perhaps a higher power that he is unable to control. He is simply a hand in this larger machine. And notice the consonants again, which we saw earlier with bullets smacking the belly. Cold, clockwork. It's quite violent sounds evoked by the consonants there. The alliteration of cold and clock. He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. So running towards this green hedge, we have this pause, this moment of contemplation, asking the question, and listening between the footfalls for the reason of his running suggests to me that he sort of lost his reason for being there. He doesn't know why he's fighting. And it might be about war being futile. Perhaps there is no reason for him, or that the experiences of war are so painful that it seems impossible to justify them. Statuary kind of means like a statue. So again, if he's like a statue, he has paused to have this moment of contemplation. It's interesting how we have gone from this external, hot, uncomfortable suffering and drifted to the internal moment of contemplation here through this rhetorical question and this trying to find a reason for the running towards this green hedge. Okay. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open silent, its eyes standing out. So there's quite a lot of image of farming and agriculture here. Shot slashed furrows. Well, these are some furrows. The farmer might plough, use and build these furrows to aid the growing of plants, in their land. So you might plant the seed in the rivets you can see, and then perhaps with another machine flatten the ground out again so that the seeds are nice and planted. But these furrows have been slashed by shots. The bullet fire has destroyed them. So this perhaps once a fertile, bullets have sort of destroyed the land. This once fertile farming land, which would have been used to grow crops, has been destroyed, is being wrecked. This war, this conflict is wreaking havoc on this natural space. Remember, Ted Hughes was a war poet, so it's quite sensible to presume that he would have had some sort of sympathy with the idea of war destroying this green and fertile land. We've already heard that this was a field of clods, so this field of dirt, this once perhaps green space for growing crops. And we have some more imagery of nature here. Threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame. Here is a hare, a rabbit-like creature, and it's the only other living thing that we see in this poem. We might say that the colour yellow was significant here. Perhaps it has a connotation of cowardice or fear. Yellow may be significant, but also this hare, it rolled like a flame. And comparing this hare to a flame, imagine rolling like a flame, and it's about pain, being on fire almost. And again, we have the only other living thing that the soldier seems to come across in this poem is essentially an image of pain, horror, and death. It crawled. So if you're crawling, once again, you're in pain, you're struggling to move. And perhaps it echoes the way that the man was struggling to move earlier. Perhaps this whole hare echoes the man's experience himself as a soldier. We know it's scared. We know it's perhaps represents horror because its mouth is wide open and it's silent and its eyes are standing out. So this sheer image of fear and terror. And it's crawling in a threshing circle. Now, what is threshing? Well, threshing, perhaps if you were a farmer, you have a machine like this. What you do, you put in corn and it sorts the grain from the chaff. So all the bits of the corn or the wheat, that you're growing, that you don't need, it sorts it out for you. So it has an agricultural image, but there is a double meaning too. Threshing is a movement you make when you're sort of in pain, when you're writhing around in agony, you would be threshing. So not only is this hair rolling like a flame and crawling, it is threshing, it is in agony. So it's really a really significant image in the poem. Anyway, he carries on running. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. Repetition of this idea of running towards a hedge. So where is the enemy here? The enemy doesn't seem to be mentioned. Who is he fighting against? Well, it's almost as if he's just attacking this natural image of a green hedge and he's plunging past it with his bayonet still in his hand. And another really, really important, interesting line. King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. So, king, honour, human dignity, etc. Now this word etc. is clearly very dismissive of these abstract notions. King might represent patriotism, honour. That's how we expect soldiers to behave, isn't it? To be honourable during conflict. Human dignity. Well, dignified behaviour, patriotism and honour, in this scenario of this man and this experience at war, they drop like luxuries. They are not things which soldiers can afford. They drop. In wartime, perhaps, we don't have dignity. It is replaced by terror, fear and violence. And it's, once again, we have this suggestion that he doesn't feel patriotic, which we would have heard about earlier. Where is it? The patriotic tear. So this idea that he's just not patriotic anymore. In a yelling alarm, well, you yell when you're scared, don't you? To get out of that blue, crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. Now, this is a difficult image at the end of the poem, and it's one that I've struggled with myself, but let's look at some dynamite. What does dynamite do? It explodes, it causes pain, it wreaks havoc, it brings death. And if his terror has become touchy dynamite, it's almost as if his fear and his anger, and this man seems to be now he is fear, he is horror. And if his terror has become dynamite, it's almost like he has become a weapon. You know, he's had to let go of dignity, human honour. He's had to let go of patriotism, and he's just charging towards this green hedge, perhaps unaware of what he's doing. And this image of dynamite is one of destruction, and it perhaps suggests that he has become the dynamite, his terror, and he is now a soldier or a weapon, and he feels that. Perhaps Ted Hughes wants us to feel about how soldiers are forced into this scenario where they are almost like weapons. Their purpose is to destroy or destruct or explode. Okay, that was the line by line, having a look at the language. Of course, I wouldn't have covered everything. There would be some things I missed. What are the key themes? Well, particularly if I was thinking about comparing with other poems, I would be thinking about the experience of this soldier. It is confusing. It is disorientating. He is unsure why he is there. He stops to question why he is there. So we're looking at the theme of the sort of the role of the soldier here. We also have some experiences of war as a key theme. His experiences are of heat and of pain, of agony, of bullets and smacking, these sounds, these painful verbs like lugged, stumbling. So we have the theme of the experience of a soldier at war. and it's a painful one. Then we have lots of natural images, and the way that perhaps nature is being destroyed by conflict. All right, so what about the structure? Well, there are 3 stanzas, okay? There is no particular strict rhythmic pattern or rhyme scheme to follow here. Why? Well, if you want to write a poem that is disorientating and confusing and shocking, why would you perhaps want to stick to those patterns? But we do have some things repeated, like this image of the green hedge. The first line is significant. Suddenly, it draws us into this disorientating action straight away. The last line is significant, and remember, if you're talking about last lines and first lines, you are talking about structure, the story of the poem, the way it progresses as we read it. We also have lots of enjambment. The shot/furrows throw up a yellow hair, so this idea that the lines run on to the next line, which again could echo the confusion, the disorientating quick experience of the soldier. You may remember me trying to read this opening line. I mean, where do we pause? Where's the first full stop? This sentence seems to go on forever, which again, it's hard to read. It's disorientating. There's all this action. It's quick, and so the punctuation and the long extended sentences and the enjambment contribute to this idea of disorientation and confusion. Potential comparisons. Well, for me, there's many poems that you could compare this to in the anthology. Any ones which are about conflict at war might be suitable. So you might be thinking about exposure. Well, both poems deal with nature in a different way. That looks a bit like an M. Both poems about the duty of soldiers in exposure. The soldiers question why they're there, as they do in Bayonet Charge. And just the experiences of soldiers at war. Exposure has the experiences of many men, whereas Bayonet Charge is about one person, although it could be a universal experience. I would also think about Charge of the Light Brigade. Again, it's a violent poem with lots of action, lots of onomatopoeia, the sounds and the settings of war, and similarly we have men charging towards an enemy, though a nice way to compare the two might be about how Charge of the Light Brigade seems to have this element of patriotism and honour, whereas in Bayonet Charge the patriotism and the honour have faded away, they've dropped like luxuries. Okay.